There's something about stories like this that makes people uncomfortable, not because they're violent, but because they're quiet. This one doesn't begin with a scream. It begins the way most days do, slowly, normally. That's the unsettling part. When a town disappears, we want the reason to be obvious. A fire, a disaster with a name. But this story doesn't give you that. What makes it haunting isn't that everyone vanished. It's how long it took anyone to notice. The town was small. One main road, a handful of side streets. If you passed through, you probably wouldn't have stopped. People woke up, went to work, came home, did it again, and then, one morning, that rhythm stopped. Not loudly, just quietly. The town didn't vanish the way people imagine. Houses didn't collapse. There was no sign of a struggle. The buildings were still there, the lights were off, and nobody answered when people knocked. Officials struggled to describe what they found. On paper, everything was where it should have been. Cars parked neatly in driveways, meals half prepared, doors unlocked. Imagine standing in a place where life had clearly been happening just hours earlier. Shoes by the door, notes on kitchen tables, and no explanation. No sign anyone planned to leave. Just absence. The first people to arrive thought it was a mistake. A local event had pulled everyone away. That assumption didn't last, because the longer they stayed, the harder it became to explain why every house told the same story, the same stillness, the same interruption mid-routine. At some point, someone said it out loud. This doesn't make sense. That's when fear started creeping in. The quiet kind, when explanations run out. To understand, you have to rewind. Look at the town when it was still alive. If you had visited a few months earlier, there would have been nothing to warn you. Life followed a pattern so steady it was invisible. Lights flicking on before sunrise, the same cars pulling out. People waved. They always waved. The town didn't have much, but it had enough. A general store, a post office, a small school. What's worth noting is that people didn't tend to leave, not permanently. They talked about leaving the way they talked about winning the lottery. Something you joked about without planning for. Yet, when investigators later pieced together the final weeks, they noticed something subtle. Not alarming, just slightly off. A shop closing earlier than usual, a delivery skipped, someone missing from a regular appointment. Individually, it meant nothing. But patterns don't usually unravel all at once. One resident mentioned the nights had felt quieter, another remembered dogs barking less. There were no reports of strangers, no large gatherings. The town seemed to fade out unevenly, like a radio signal losing strength. There isn't a single moment everyone agrees on. The night arrived the same way it always did. Dinner was cooked, doors were locked, radios played softly. The last confirmed sighting came early in the evening. A passing motorist saw a couple talking outside a house. He didn't slow down. What investigators could say with confidence was this: there were no signs of panic, no broken windows, no overturned furniture. Instead, the town looked like it had simply paused. One of the more unsettling details was the sound, or the lack of it. No one reported hearing anything that night. No engines, no shouting. At some point, every light went out. Gradually, power logs suggested individual homes powering down. People turned things off, which raises a question no one has ever answered. Why would everyone do that? One house at a time. The first indication came from a delivery driver just after dawn. He stopped at the general store. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was where it should have been. Register closed. Shelves stocked. He tried another building. Same result. He drove out and reported what he'd seen, expecting someone to laugh it off. They didn't. By the second morning, search teams moved street by street. They hadn't expected this. The town hadn't been abandoned the way places usually are. No signs of packing. Clothing still hung in closets. Shoes paired neatly by doors. In one kitchen, a pot rested on the stove, cold. In another, bread hardened on the counter. These were the leftovers of interrupted routines. Beds were unmade in some houses, carefully made in others. It suggested people hadn't all been doing the same thing when they disappeared. Some vehicles were gone, but there were no tire tracks, no evidence of a mass departure. And yet dozens of people were missing. Certain things were almost always left behind: wallets, keys, family photos. Other things were almost always gone: coats, sturdy shoes. It suggested intent without preparation, movement without planning. One official described it bluntly: "It looks like people stepped out, but never came back." As days passed, theories formed and collapsed. A voluntary evacuation? There was no paperwork, no transport logs, no destination. A slow abandonment. Utility records told a different story. Power usage dropped sharply, not gradually. Someone had been there the night before. Environmental contamination. Tests showed nothing. No radiation, no chemical residue. Each explanation failed. The quiet details began to matter more. Nearly every home had clocks stopped at different times, some at 2:17 a.m., others closer to dawn. When mapped, clusters of houses were frozen within the same 10-minute window. Pets were missing, livestock remained, fed, contained. It suggested selectivity. Someone had time to make choices, and there was no sign of resistance, no barricaded doors, no defensive damage. Whatever happened, it happened with cooperation. Years later, the story migrated to personal blogs and message boards. A journalist piecing together timelines wrote a draft article. It never ran. His editor stopped responding. When he resurfaced, he called the project a misunderstanding and never used the word town again. A researcher tracking former residents found some briefly appeared in new places: voter registrations, rental agreements. Then they vanished again. When she contacted one, the reply was polite: "I'm where I'm supposed to be now. Please don't follow this." Others who visited described a strange effect. They would arrive with questions, then lose interest mid-investigation. They'd leave not feeling disappointed, but resolved, as if the town answered a question they hadn't realized they were asking. Empty places don't stay the same, but here decay was uneven. Weather passed through, yet one house would lose shingles while the next stayed intact. Then came the repairs. Fresh boards appeared over broken windows. Doors forced open during investigations were closed again. Trash left behind vanished. No permits were filed. No crews were recorded. But someone was tending to the place. Satellite imagery showed something stranger. Over time, certain structures were removed completely, mostly municipal buildings, records, offices, communication hubs. The rest of the town remained, as if someone had selectively erased only what stored information. The most unsettling theory is usually mentioned last. The town didn't vanish. It moved, not on a map, but in function. According to this, the town fulfilled its purpose. Whatever it was built for reached completion. The residents weren't taken. They were reassigned. That would explain the compliance, the lack of panic. It would explain why people appeared briefly elsewhere, then went quiet, why records weren't destroyed, just edited, why the town remains maintained, but empty, like a system on standby. If that's true, then the town isn't a tragedy. It's a transition point. And the unsettling part isn't that it happened. It's that it could happen again, quietly, without anyone noticing until there's nothing left to notice. Every story like this tempts you to look for a hidden door, a confession, but this one doesn't offer that. The town still exists, not as a place you visit, but as a question you carry. It shows up whenever we assume things don't disappear unless something goes wrong. Because here nothing broke, no violence, no chaos, just a town that reached a point where it was no longer needed. If you drive past where it once stood, there's nothing telling you to stop, no marker, no reason to slow down. And maybe that's the point. The most effective disappearances aren't dramatic. They're orderly. They're quiet. They happen while everyone's paying attention somewhere else. The town didn't vanish overnight. It simply stopped asking to be remembered. And eventually, most people agreed.